I would like to give a stage to Jayant Narayan, who will share global perspectives and examples of AI governance. Jayant Narayan is currently managing the World Economic Forum's Global AI Action Alliance, a collaborative platform to accelerate the benefits of AI while mitigating its risks. He works with leaders from across the public and private sectors on issues related to technology and AI sector, AI strategies, its deployment, and governance. Jayant has started his career as a software engineer working for Fortune 500 clients. Later, he transitioned to public policy, working on various policy issues like India's law on electronic waste recycling. In his previous roles at the Economic World Forum, Jayant has been instrumental in launching a couple of projects. One of them is the Forum's Global Lighthouse Network, a network of factories leading technology and innovation. As well, he helped to build a strategy for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Network. That I'll be intrigued to get some of the questions about it later on. So welcome, Jayant, to virtual stage. That is currently live streamed from Vilnius, Lithuania. And would you rather say you are an engineer that loves to build things on a bigger scale, or you are a policymaker that knows how to code?
It's a great question. Firstly, thank you so much to you and the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share my views. I would say I'm a little bit of both. I still have that engineer's brain, which likes building, but I think this topic is becoming so critical and crucial, the intersection of technology and policy, that it's good that I have had that experience and background in technology. So whenever we are speaking about governance of technology, it's not just at a principles or at a theoretical level. It also makes most sense from what we are seeing in the industry in terms of actual applications. So a little bit of both is my answer.
Great. So looking forward to hear your presentation today, and the floor is all yours.
Very good morning, good evening, good afternoon to the speakers, depending the audience, depending on where you're joining us from. Once again, thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. I'll be sharing some thoughts and perspectives related to AI governance, and this is basis my role within the World Economic Forum, where I'm managing the Global AI Action Alliance. And I will be talking a little bit about that as well. So I will just get right into it. Before I do that, a very quick introduction. I'm sure most of you who are listening to me would have heard about the World Economic Forum. I know we are famous for our Davos meeting, our annual meeting in Davos. We are the International Organization for Public-Private Cooperation, and our mission is to improve the state of the world by getting together stakeholders from all different domains across a variety of topics. And really, we provide this neutral platform for building communities of trust and for running different projects and initiatives. Very quickly, the part of the World Economic Forum that I represent is called the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution Network. This was started in 2017. We are headquartered in San Francisco, and now we have centers across 15 countries. And this ranges from everywhere in Asia to Africa to Latin America to the Middle East. And through the center, we are working on piloting new approaches to technology adoption and governance across different areas: artificial intelligence, blockchain, IoT and smart cities, data policy, drones, autonomous vehicles, et cetera, et cetera. My role, just repeating that here, the Global AI Action Alliance was launched in January of 2021. And it's really an accelerator for incubating new projects and initiatives related to both responsible AI as well as AI for SDGs. We are funded by the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And on our steering committee, the co-chairs are the president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, Mr. Vilas Dhar, and also Mr. Arvind Krishna, who's the global CEO and chairman of IBM. Now, diving right into the topic, this is a beautiful sort of visual that I got from the Council of Europe. This just shows what's happening when it comes to AI policy and governance. And I'm sure a number of you listening in would have heard about responsible AI, trustworthy AI, the risks associated with AI. Is AI going to impact society in a negative way? So there's a lot of talk. And sometimes it's important to cut through a little bit of that noise to really understand what's happening at the governance level. And this visual shows that there's actually a lot happening at the governance level. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but as you can see, there are over 506 documents which have been which have been released, which are related to AI policy and governance. And this ranges from everything from a government releasing something like a national AI strategy to international organizations releasing documents on responsible AI, ethical usage of AI, et cetera, et cetera. And clearly 2018 and 2019, as you can see from this figure, was a hot year when it comes to the number of frameworks which were released. And what does this mean? If we look at what are the implications of this, the good side is that the world is actually sitting up and taking notice that AI adoption is really accelerating across multiple industry sectors. You can see its impact and usage pretty much everywhere. So governments and regulators are sitting up and taking notice. Civil society is calling for action. So it's good that that acknowledgement is there. On the other hand, there's been a proliferation of principles. Like out of these 506 documents, there are over 300 or 400 guidelines or principles related to responsible usage of AI. And sometimes that can also mean that there's just a flood of principles. And it can sometimes also be a bit confusing when it comes to the actual developers and deployers of AI and ML solutions as to what does it mean? How do I really integrate and operationalize on these principles? So that's the broad landscape that you can see here. Of course, there are some countries which are fast movers. There are some regions which are fast movers, even on the governance side. Everyone here must have heard about EU's AI Act, which was released earlier this year. And different countries are trying and testing different policy levers related to AI policy and governance. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that shortly. This is just some of the examples I've taken about what's happening, just to show you the whole length and breadth of what's happening in the space of AI policy and governance. So on the leftmost side, as you can see, is the European Commission's rules on artificial intelligence, the AI Act, which is now already getting feedback from different stakeholder groups, will then later be debated before it becomes an official law. And this is the first big example of a region coming together to really drive forth governance or regulation on artificial intelligence. And the risk-based approach taken by the EU, which clearly says that there are certain applications of AI which are higher risk and must be regulated, is something which is resonating well with a number of other regions as well. Secondly, on this page, what you see is the recent release of the guidelines from UNESCO, the draft recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which has been adopted by the member states. So obviously, when we talk about doing this at a UN body level, and when you're driving consensus across so many countries, you can imagine that some of these principles or guidelines tend to be much more macro in nature, because every country has its own set of local laws as well, which cross intersect with AI. It's not that when we write policy and governance for AI, you have to start from scratch. There are foundational elements and pillars already. And some of these, when you look at it from an industry perspective, that's the third example that's given here. Like the US government's Food and Drug Administration's artificial and machine learning based action plan, the action plan for AI and ML in software as a medical device. So as you can see that there are a lot more nuances that come in when you go at an industry level. So going from left to right, what we've seen is that a region coming up with a broad set of governance. On AI, we have seen what happens when an IO at the UN level comes up with draft recommendations, more macro in nature, and then there are some sector-specific nuances. And obviously, I would say healthcare is also one of those sensitive, higher risk areas. So it has to take in some additional considerations, especially because the AI and ML solution would be impacting the life of a human being. That's why it's higher risk as well. And the last document that you see here, or the last example that you see here, is Veritas, which is from the Singapore government, which is the Monetary Authority of Singapore, working with the financial services companies in its ecosystems to really help them with fairness and reducing bias in financial service applications. Some of you, again, might have heard one of the use cases related to, there are several use cases related to AI in financial services. The sensitive ones, if I may call it that way, are the usage of AI in financial services for credit underwriting. And that's where we have seen some issues in the past, where automated algorithm was discriminating against a certain ethnic group or a certain gender group. And the attempt here, through efforts like Veritas, are to make sure that financial service companies, when they're rolling out these AI and ML solutions, are doing this in a way which is not biased and it's not discriminating against certain groups. And all this information is available online. So just to give you that macro snapshot, I've taken these different industry level examples as well as more macro examples. So what are the considerations? If I am a company or if I'm a government, what does this really mean for me? So from a company perspective, there's obviously this concern almost that what does this mean in terms of regulatory harmonization and alignment? If, especially when I'm a business operating in an international environment, I work across geographies, if there's too much divergence at a regulatory level, it would mean that my compliance team across the globe would have a lot more work to do, and this creates some operational hassles. So it's also in the best interest for global smooth operations of business that there's some sort of regulatory harmonization. From a government perspective, one of the considerations would obviously be the voluntary guidelines versus soft law versus hard law, because governments are trying to play that balance, something that I've written in the third point here. Like, how do you balance governance with innovation? So depending on your country's specific nuances, the size of the country, the existing laws, you're exploring different policy levers. And again, this is also a function, this is not just a blanket decision that you can take. This also, again, depends on the specific use cases, the specific industry sectors that we are talking about, something that the EU's AI Act has tried to do, which is take that risk-based approach. It does acknowledge that there are certain applications of AI and ML which do not have, let's say, ethical or responsible implications as such. AI in healthcare is very different from using a manufacturing level data for building algorithms. There's a lot more consideration on responsibility and ethics on the healthcare side. And lastly, and this is by no means, again, an exhaustive list, but lastly, an important consideration, no matter which stakeholder group you are, is obviously ensuring the interests and rights of the most vulnerable groups, because there's a proliferation of AI applications out there. And sometimes the gap that we notice is that the end user who's being impacted, who's actually using that solution, has not always necessarily been fully taken into account while designing that system. That thing is changing, but there's a lot more that can be done on that front. And just to give you an example of how the World Economic Forum approaches this, so we work both at macro level as well as a micro level. At a macro level, we could be working on things like the national AI strategy. We run a peer network between countries to learn from each other. Some of them have already rolled out national AI strategies. Some of them are in the process of writing it. Some of them are in the process of implementing it, which is the most important part. So we work across highlighting best practices. We work on governance frameworks, like the usage of AI in healthcare chatbots. And all these reports can be found online for those of you who are interested. We also work at a use case level, like facial recognition, again, a sensitive topic. So how do you make sure that when you're deploying facial recognition, you're doing that in a responsible way? And the example that I've shared here is of the use case on flow management, which is the usage of facial recognition, for example, in airports. So what are the guidelines that you can follow to make sure that you're doing this in a responsible and unbiased manner? Then we also work on toolkits and pilots, toolkits like the Empowering AI Leadership, which we had developed for the board of companies. But we also work on, we are currently also releasing version 2.0 of this, which is to work directly with the C-suite and to do a bit of capacity building, because we have noticed that not all industry sectors are at the same level when it comes to the understanding of artificial intelligence, both at their C-suite as well as the board level. And then some pilot examples here, where we work, for example, with the New Zealand government on reimagining regulation for the age of AI. So how do you really build an AI ecosystem, an AI governance ecosystem as well, by taking in the interest of the citizens through citizens' participation? So these are just a few examples of our work. For those of you who are interested, a lot more examples are present on the forum's website that you can check out. And just to deep dive a little bit, just to give you a flavor of what this means when we say this is a forum project. And I'll take two very quick examples here. The example here is AI procurement in a box. The genesis of this project was our collaboration with the UK government's Office of AI, where they wanted to roll out guidelines for public sector entities which are procuring artificial intelligence to make sure that they are doing this in a responsible way. So what does that mean in practice? That means that if you are asking a vendor to provide you an AI and ML solution, you're making sure that you're putting the right kind of requirements in the tendering process. So obviously things like your data sets have to be unbiased. Your AI and ML solution should not be discriminatory. Again, depending on the specific usage or the specific ministry for which we are procuring this. And we piloted this with the UK government, then with UAE and Bahrain, and right now there's a Spanish version which is being released or has just been released. And then there are ongoing pilots in Chile, Colombia, and Brazil. So our goal is to obviously scale up these guidelines across the globe, while acknowledging that there are different nuances at a country level which have to be factored in. And the last example, again, which I was just referring to, is on facial recognition flow management. What we try to do with the forum's frameworks like this, ideally, we want this to be evidence-based work. So we always try and partner with the right entities on the ground who can actually pilot the frameworks, which can help us iterate on the framework and also revise it depending on the realities on the ground, and then to scale it up across the globe. So this one on flow management, where we're working with airports, as you can see, we have done this with Paris Airport. We've also done this with Tokyo Airport and relevant certification bodies like AFNOT, but also obviously the tech providers and big tech companies like Microsoft, IBM, Government of France. And there's a version 2.0 of this project, where the use case that we work on is the law enforcement one, which is where a lot of concerns have come up from civil society related to surveillance and how do law enforcement agencies use facial recognition in a responsible manner. And over there, what we are trying to do is to really make sure that, again, you're doing this in an ethical and responsible manner. And over there, we are working with Interpol. So this is just a broad snapshot. I could talk about this topic for days and weeks at an end, but I would really once again like to thank the organizers for this opportunity, and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So thank you, Jayant, very much for your presentation. And I promised in the introduction that I would like to get back to the question. So what is this fourth industrial revolution that you've been working on?
Sure. I mean, fourth industrial revolution, if you define the revolution itself, you're already seeing the blurring of lines between the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. So you're talking about AI, 3D printing, IoT, blockchain, and everyday life. And if you would like to talk about the forum's work, obviously our founder and executive chairman, Professor Klaus Schwab, had written the book on the fourth industrial revolution several years ago. And that, in fact, was the inspiration for the forum as the international organization to really kick off work on the fourth industrial revolution. And what we are trying to do here is to really make sure that the trajectory of these technologies is being developed in a responsible manner so that we can maximize the benefits from them and while mitigating the associated harms. I know that's a very, very short answer. There are so many complexities to this topic, but I think I wanted to start off with that.
But how far we are from reaching it, and how you and me and the rest of the society should get ready and prepare for the upcoming changes.
That's a question which is worthy for ministers and heads of states, but a very important question nevertheless. I think there's a bit of responsibility and role for everyone. How far are we from meeting it? I'll be very honest. I think there's a long way to go. Like companies are increasingly taking notice, especially the developers of these technology, about the implications of it, about the broader societal implications. So are regulators. I think from the company's perspective, they have to continue to be responsible in the technology development. There are a number of cases where technology has been developed which is not being used for the best interests of society. But there are also multiple examples where it is being used for the best interest of society. Artificial intelligence itself, like you could use the facial recognition software for mass surveillance, but then there are also multiple examples where machine learning algorithms are being used for optimizing electricity grid efficiency, or even climate change modeling. So there are good and bad sides to every technology. I think it's the prioritization and the push from stakeholders on the positive use cases is the important part. But what I also feel from a citizen and a general society perspective is there's a big role and there is a big need for continued education and capacity building, because there's still so much noise related to artificial intelligence. And I have to admit, it's thrown around like a buzzword quite a lot, because there are several applications where people say, oh, this is artificial intelligence. And I would say that it's just basic automation. But because it's become that buzzword, there's not that much awareness. So, yes, education and awareness of citizens. So, looking at examples from countries like Finland, for example, where they were really trying to educate most of their citizens on artificial intelligence because they acknowledge that this is a technology which will become very deeply integrated into our lives. So it will be a combination of all these things, the right sort of governance from governments, the right sort of education of civil society, their voice being heard, and of course, companies being responsible. But I do say that this is not just to give a free rein to any company and say that, yeah, we just trust you. And that's why EU released that AI Act. There are sensitive use cases where I think it's fairly well and reasonable from regulators to also demand some sort of conformity and ways for companies to demonstrate that they are being responsible. The final point that I would add here is this is also where agile governance and the new age of policy making comes in. This is no longer the old style policy making where a couple of people get together in a parliament and pass a law. Agile governance has to involve all stakeholders, so very much multi-stakeholder, get in inputs from the company, get in inputs from the civil society, and keep iterating, because tech is changing so much. You can't write one policy document and then not look at it. You might have to revisit it in less than a year to adapt it on the basis of the evolving technologies. So the new age of governance is also about this being agile and constantly iterating on the policies you're making.
But how collaborative are we on making this path towards this future that you are describing? Are the countries, different European countries, find the common ground on the action plan?
Uh, I think the right steps are being taken, and that's where I'll go back to my point to focus on use cases which are of common interest. And we just finished COP26, and as I was highlighting, one of the things that's mentioned in the action plan is not just the governance side of AI, but also building that European ecosystem where you can have a lot more AI and ML development. So focusing and building alignment on those use cases which are in the best interest of society. So like AI for optimization of, as I was saying, on energy efficiency side, for example, and that's just one example. So as long as a set of European countries which are aligned on values can share knowledge and experience and help accelerate the deployment of AI and ML for positive use cases, that's the right way to go. I understand there are a lot of political sensitivities. So even just within EU, there might be differences even related to the EU's AI. And as you can imagine, at an international level, sometimes that gets complicated further. So we are taking steps in that right direction. There are a number of alliances that are trying to foster that collaboration and cooperation, but of course, we can be doing a lot more.
And in the beginning, we spoke that you are an engineer and you still have this in you. So I'm sure you still keep an eye on the startups developing various solutions in the market. So maybe you can share the latest or the most interesting solution that you come across so far.
It's such a big and rich ecosystem. I'm not going to name any specific startups, but I would like to talk about some of the big trends that obviously companies are exploring. And again, most of the listeners here would be aware that one of the things about AI is that a number of the use cases and applications have still been very narrow in nature. That the AI and ML solution is very good at delivering solutions for one specific thing, but the algorithm goes haywire. That contextual intelligence is missing. So while I personally am not expecting the world to move towards general artificial intelligence in the next 10 years, I think there are a number of applications where this contextual intelligence is being increasingly explored, and also reinforcement learning and learning from unstructured data. Learning from structured data, supervised learning, all this thing has been explored and is still being explored and still has useful applications. But contextual intelligence, transferability of one algorithm and a specific use case to another problem set, which is related but not exactly the same, is I think the next frontier which is being explored. And then there are a number of other things as well. Something that I've mentioned in some of my previous talks as well. Like for smaller companies, I think there's an important element on inclusivity. If you're not a giant company, you obviously don't have the same kind of resources and the whole army of data scientists, right, who can help you get to your goals related to AI. So there are solutions like no code AI which are also being developed, which increase the accessibility so that even small and medium enterprises without a whole army of data scientists can start exploring that and start bringing that in to solve some of their business problems.
I see. So maybe you can also comment on what would actually boost the ecosystem from the government cooperation with the startups. Now, the widely discussed topic are the sandbox that could actually get the access to the data when we speak about getting solutions right, not just experimenting with the numbers, but actually getting the right numbers or right data, the actual data, into creating the solutions. What do you think about that?
Excellent question. And I think any discussion on AI is also essentially a discussion on data. And it's a great point that you bring up. I think there is definitely room for governments within that protected regulatory sandbox or policy sandbox, as you're talking about, to consider the sharing of data in the right way, with the right kind of privacy and the right kind of cybersecurity in place, to enable large-scale machine learning algorithms. And I think there are a number of areas where this is both needed. I think it's also reflected in EU, in the various documents that they have released on data sharing. In fact, when it comes to sharing of data related to health research, the biggest challenge over there is the sensitivity, because it's personally identifiable information. But there is a big merit for individuals to be allowed to use their data, obviously stripping it off of confidential information for the broader interest of humanity. Because the more data that is being fed into things like precision medicine, drug discovery, the better it is for the world. So I think there's definitely a role for governments to enable that sandbox. Again, specific industries, you can start off with a couple of use cases, as I was saying, and it's happening. It's not like it's not happening. There are examples like the Melody Consortia, where pharma companies, for example, are already sharing data and doing drug discovery. And I keep going back to that example. Like, look at the non-sensitive areas to begin with. I'm saying non-sensitive where there's no direct implication, for example, when it comes to direct consumer-facing applications. On industrial AI, on manufacturing data, there's a lot of room for sharing within companies, within regions over there, especially when it comes to operational efficiency or machine breakdown. So enabling the data sharing over there can obviously make the algorithms much better and deliver much better results. But this also means that there's a lot of investment also needed from the government side. And the EU in particular could also look at what's happening in the US, and China, which is putting a lot of money into this space. So that amount of big investment to lay the foundational elements for the ecosystem will also have to come from the government side as much as it is coming from the private sector and big tech companies.
Great. So thank you, Jayant, for your insightful answers. Our time is up for today. So I really appreciate of giving us this opportunity to look of what kind of ideas are cooking behind the doors of European Forum. So thank you. And next, we will have another interesting presentation shortly.
Thank you so much.